The rain hammered against the farmhouse windows like bullets against glass. Margaret wiped flour from her hands, glancing at the clock. 3:47 a.m. Another sleepless night in a string of endless hollow hours since David's funeral 6 months ago. The kitchen counter bore the evidence of her desperation. 23 apple pies cooling on wire racks. She'd been baking since midnight, the only way to silence the voices in her head. The creditors. The neighbors. The school principal who looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and judgment reserved for women who couldn't hold their lives together. Mommy. 8-year-old Emma stood in the doorway, her blonde hair tangled from sleep, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Behind her, the twins Claire and Sophie, barely 6, peered through the darkness with identical blue eyes that reminded Margaret too much of their father. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Margaret's voice carried the weight of exhaustion she tried to hide during daylight hours. I heard noises. Are the bad men coming again? The question hit like a physical blow. Last week, 2 men in expensive suits had knocked on their door. Polite smiles, cold eyes. They'd asked about David's debts with the kind of patience that felt like a countdown timer. No bad men, just Mommy making breakfast early. Emma didn't move. At 8, she'd already learned to read the spaces between her mother's words, the pauses that meant danger, the forced smiles that preceded tears. The barn light is on, Claire whispered. Margaret's blood froze. She'd locked that barn herself before dinner. The wind could explain many things, but not electric lights turning themselves. Aunt, stay here, don't move, don't open the door for anyone. She grabbed David's old baseball bat from the closet, her hands trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the familiar weight. The same bat he'd used to teach Emma how to swing last summer, back when their biggest worry was whether the tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. The rain had turned the dirt path into sucking mud that pulled at her boots with each step. The barn door hung open, creaking on its hinges. Light spilled out like a wound in the darkness. Inside, sprawled across the hay bales, lay a man she'd never seen before. Blood had soaked through his white shirt, spreading across his chest in a pattern that looked disturbingly artistic under the harsh barn light. His face was pale, angular, with the kind of bone structure that belonged in magazines rather than collapsed in her barn at 4 in the morning. He wasn't dead. His chest rose and fell with the labored rhythm of someone fighting to stay conscious. A cell phone lay shattered beside him, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks. Margaret stood frozen, bat raised, studying this stranger who'd somehow found his way into her life. His clothes were expensive, hand-tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, caked with mud, the kind of money that didn't accidentally end up bleeding in random barns. His eyes opened, dark, calculating even in pain. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her step backward. Please. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an authority that seemed at odds with his current helplessness. They can't find me here. Who? Can't find you? He tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back, a sound escaping his throat that might have been laughter or pain. Everyone? Margaret looked toward the house, where 3 small faces pressed against the kitchen window. Her daughters watching, waiting, trusting her to make the right choice. The choice that would keep them safe. But safe from what? The man bleeding in her barn or the world that had put him there? You need a hospital. No hospitals. He reached into his jacket with obvious effort, pulling out a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. Please, just let me rest. Here tonight. I'll be gone in the morning. The money sat between them like an accusation. Margaret had never seen that much cash in one place. Enough to pay the overdue mortgage, enough to buy groceries without counting pennies, enough to silence the creditors for another month. Who are you? Nobody you want to know. The honesty was more unsettling than a lie would have been. Margaret found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the monster she expected to find. Instead, she saw exhaustion that mirrored her own, the particular weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. My daughters are in the house. I know. His eyes closed again. Saw the lights. 3 of them. You read bedtime stories. The middle one laughs too loud during the funny parts. The casual surveillance should have terrified her. Instead, it felt oddly protective, as if this stranger had been watching over them rather than stalking them. "You've been watching us. Safe house is a mile away. Been there 2 weeks. Your girls play in the yard every afternoon at 3:30. The oldest one makes sure the younger ones don't go near the road." Margaret lowered the bat slightly. "What happened to you?" "Business disagreement." He opened his eyes again, studying, her face with the same intensity she'd been using on him. "You're going to help me." It wasn't a question. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't name. This man, broken and bleeding in her barn, somehow saw her more clearly than anyone had in months. Not as a victim. Not as a burden. As someone capable of making hard choices. Why? Because you need the money. And because... He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Because you understand what it means to be left alone, with everything falling apart. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the barn roof. Margaret stood at a crossroads she hadn't seen coming, holding a baseball bat and staring down at a stranger who offered salvation, wrapped in danger. She thought about Emma's question. Are the bad men coming again? Maybe they were already here. Maybe they'd been here all along, wearing the faces of bank managers and debt collectors and helpful neighbors who whispered about how she'd never manage alone. "One night," she said finally. His smile was barely visible, but she felt its impact like a physical force. One night. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. Margaret. She hadn't told him her name. Dawn crept through the kitchen, windows like an unwelcome witness. Margaret stood at the sink washing the same coffee cup for the third time, her eyes fixed on the barn where Vincent Torino lay hidden beneath horse blankets she'd brought him at 5 a.m. Vincent Torino. He'd whispered the name when she'd checked his pulse. A confession or a warning. She'd recognized it from newspaper headlines that always seemed to involve words like alleged and investigation and no comment. The girls ate their cereal in unusual silence, sensing the electric tension that crackled around their mother like static before a storm. Emma kept glancing toward the window, her 8-year-old intuition picking up signals Margaret wished she could hide. "Mommy, why did you go outside in the dark?" "Checking on the animals." "We don't have animals." Claire's observation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "We're thinking about getting some chickens." The lie came too easily. It should have bothered her more. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, moving with the predatory slowness of a shark circling wounded prey. Margaret's hands stilled on the dish towel as 2 men emerged, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested extensive practice. "Girls, go upstairs. Now." "But Mommy." "Now, Emma." The older man approached the front door while his partner circled toward the back of the house. Professional. Methodical. Margaret recognized the pattern from crime shows, though experiencing it felt nothing like television had prepared her for. The knock was polite. 3 soft raps that somehow managed to convey both patience and inevitability. Margaret opened the door with trembling fingers, keeping her body positioned to block any view of the house's interior. "Mrs. Fletcher?" The man's smile belonged in a funeral home, comforting and threatening simultaneously. "Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Walsh." He showed her a badge that looked official enough, though Margaret had no idea what a real FBI badge was supposed to look like. "We're investigating an incident that occurred in this area last night. May we come in?" "What kind of incident?" "Shooting. Multiple casualties." Morrison's eyes swept past her shoulder, cataloging details with mechanical precision. "We have reason to believe one of the individuals involved may have sought shelter in this vicinity." Margaret's throat felt like sandpaper. "I haven't seen anyone." "Of course not. But you understand, Mrs. Fletcher, harboring a fugitive is a federal crime, even if done unknowingly." The emphasis on unknowingly made it clear he suspected otherwise. "Carries a sentence of 5 to 15 years. The numbers hit like physical blows. 5 to 15 years. Emma would be 23 when Margaret got out. The twins would be grown women she'd never really known. I told you I haven't seen anyone. Agent Walsh appeared around the corner of the house, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He shook his head almost imperceptibly at his partner. Mind if we take a look around your property? Just to be thorough. It wasn't really a question. Margaret stepped aside, watching helplessly as the two men began their methodical search. Her eyes drifted to the barn, where Vincent Torino lay hidden beneath blankets that suddenly seemed as transparent as tissue paper. Morrison moved through her house like he owned it, photographing seemingly random objects with his phone. The stack of overdue classified ads, the empty prescription bottles lined up beside the sink like soldiers. Difficult times? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. We're managing. Widows' benefits don't stretch very far, do they? Especially with 3 children. Margaret's jaw tightened. We're fine. Of course you are. Morrison picked up one of the apple pies cooling on the counter, studying it with the attention of a forensic scientist. Beautiful work. You sell these? Sometimes. Local. Farmer's market? Church sales? He set the pie down carefully, his fingers leaving no prints on the pristine crust. Or perhaps more. Private arrangements? The insinuation crawled under Margaret's skin like infection. This man was dissecting her life, looking for pressure points, weaknesses he could exploit. Walsh returned from his circuit of the property, his expression unreadable. All clear outside. But his eyes lingered on the barn just a moment too long. Morrison handed Margaret a business card, his smile never wavering. If you remember anything, Mrs. Fletcher, anything at all. Day or night. They left as quietly as they'd arrived, the black sedan disappearing down the dirt road like a mirage. Margaret stood in her doorway, card trembling in her fingers, watching until the dust settled. Mommy? Emma stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. Were those the bad men? Margaret closed the door and turned the deadbolt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. No, sweetheart. They were police officers. Then why do you look so scared? Sometimes the truth and fear wore the same face. Margaret pulled Emma into a hug that was as much for her own comfort as her daughter's. Because sometimes police officers scare Mommy too. An hour later, Margaret made her way to the barn with a thermos of coffee and the growing certainty that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The morning sun had burned away the rain clouds, but the shadows inside the barn seemed deeper somehow, as if they'd absorbed the darkness of the previous night. Vincent was awake, sitting upright against the hay bales with an alertness that suggested he'd heard every word of the FBI visit. The blood on his shirt had dried to a rust-colored stain, and his color had improved from corpse pale to merely haggard. Friends of yours? He asked. They knew about you. They know about everything. Vincent accepted the coffee with steady hands, studying Margaret's face over the rim of the cup. The question is what they think you know. I don't know anything. You know I'm here. You know I'm running. You know those men will come back. He sipped the coffee, his dark eyes never leaving hers. That's more than enough to destroy your life. Margaret sank onto a hay bale across from him, suddenly exhausted. Who are you really? Someone who made choices that led me to bleeding in your barn at 4 a.m. Vincent's smile was self-deprecating, almost charming. Someone who understands that good people sometimes have to do terrible things to protect what matters. I'm not a good person. No. He tilted his head, studying her with renewed interest. You took in a stranger who could have been anyone. Could have been dangerous because he was hurt and needed help. I took your money. You haven't touched the money, it's still sitting right where I left it. Vincent gestured toward the roll of bills that lay untouched on the workbench. You helped me because you couldn't walk away from someone in pain. That's who you are. Margaret stared at the money, recognizing the truth in his words. She could have taken it and run, could have called the police, could have done a dozen things. That would have been smarter, safer, more rational. Instead, she'd brought him coffee. The FBI thinks I'm hiding you. The FBI thinks a lot of things. most of them wrong. Vincent stood slowly, testing his balance. The movement was careful but controlled, suggesting his injuries were less severe than they'd appeared. But they're not wrong about the danger you're in. From you, from them, from me, from choices you haven't even made yet. Vincent approached her slowly, each step deliberate. Those men who came to your door last week, the ones asking about David's debts, they weren't creditors. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. How do you? Because I know who they work for. And I know what happens to families who can't pay what they owe. The barn fell silent except for the distant sound of the girls playing in the yard, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the darkness gathering around Margaret's life. What do you want from me? Vincent studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Nothing you're not already willing to give. He moved toward the barn door, pausing at the threshold. I'll be gone tonight, but Margaret... He turned back, his voice carrying a weight that made her name sound like a promise. This isn't over. Vincent Torino kept his promise. When Margaret checked the barn at dawn, she found nothing but disturbed hay and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air like a ghost. The roll of bills remained untouched on the workbench, a test she'd somehow passed without understanding the rules. 3 days passed in deceptive normalcy. The girls attended school. Margaret baked her pies. The overdue notices accumulated on the kitchen counter like fallen leaves. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her world, a crack in the foundation she couldn't see but felt with every step. On Thursday afternoon, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as a man in pristine coveralls unloaded boxes with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to expensive cargo. Her signature wasn't required. The driver simply set everything on the porch, tipped his cap, and disappeared as quietly as he'd arrived. 12 boxes, no return address, no shipping labels. Inside the first box, nestled in tissue paper like precious artifacts, Margaret found clothes. Designer dresses in her exact size, fabric so soft they seemed to whisper against her fingertips. How did he know her measurements? The question should have disturbed her more than it did. The second box contained toys, not the plastic carnival prizes from dollar stores, but handcrafted wooden dolls with porcelain faces and silk dresses, puzzles made from exotic woods, art supplies that smelled of possibility and dreams deferred. Emma discovered the third box before Margaret could intercept it. Mommy, look! 3 bicycles, pink, purple, and yellow. Each one perfectly sized, as if someone had been watching the girls play, measuring their growth with invisible rulers. Where did these come from? Emma's voice carried the particular suspicion of a child who'd learned that good things always came with hidden costs. Margaret studied the bicycles, their chrome handlebars catching the afternoon sunlight like promises. I don't know, sweetheart. But she did know. Vincent Torino had reached into their lives from whatever shadow world he inhabited, and left gifts that felt less like generosity than recruitment. The remaining boxes contained groceries, not the generic brands from the discount aisle, but the premium products Margaret remembered from the years before David's gambling debts consumed their savings. Organic vegetables, imported pasta, chocolate so dark it looked like edible midnight, and at the bottom of the final box, wrapped in black silk, a cell phone. Margaret held the device like it might explode, recognizing the weight of inevitability in its sleek surface. When it rang 20 minutes later, she wasn't surprised. Margaret. Vincent's voice carried the same quiet authority she remembered from the barn, but now it seemed to emerge from the phone itself, as if he'd somehow taken residence inside the technology. Why? Because your daughters deserve better than living on the edge of disaster. Margaret glanced toward the living room where Emma, Claire, and Sophie sat on the floor assembling one of the wooden puzzles. Their laughter filled the house with a lightness that had been absent for months. This isn't charity. No, Vincent agreed. It's an investment. The word hung between them like a contract waiting to be signed. Margaret understood that accepting these gifts meant accepting something else, something that couldn't be returned or exchanged. What do you want? Right now? Nothing. Tomorrow? Vincent paused, and Margaret could hear the sound of traffic in the background, the urban symphony of a world she'd never really belonged to. We'll see. The FBI came back yesterday. No, they're watching the house. I know that too. Margaret felt the walls of her safe, predictable world collapsing inward, replaced by something larger and more dangerous. I can't protect my girls from this. You can't protect them from poverty either, or from the men who came asking about David's debts. Vincent's voice softened slightly, almost fatherly. Margaret, your husband borrowed money from people who don't offer payment plans. The house, the insurance money, your pies at the farmer's market. None of it will be enough. The truth settled in her stomach like swallowed glass. She'd known it intellectually, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone who understood such calculations made it real in a way that kept her awake at night. How much time do I have? Less than you think, more than you fear. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to imagine a future where her daughters grew up safe and whole. Every scenario she constructed seemed to require choices she wasn't sure she could make. There's a restaurant downtown. Bella Notte. Friday night, 8 o'clock. Vincent's voice carried a finality that made argument seem pointless. Wear the blue dress. Margaret stared at the phone, recognizing it as both a lifeline and a leash. In the living room, Emma had completed her puzzle. A pastoral scene of children playing in a meadow, their faces bright with uncomplicated joy. Mommy, look what I made. Margaret knelt beside her daughter, studying the intricate image with its promise of innocence preserved. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Can we keep it forever? The question pierced Margaret's heart with surgical precision. Forever was a luxury she'd stopped believing in months ago, replaced by the more modest hope of making it through another day. We'll try, baby. We'll try. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Margaret tried on the blue dress. It fit perfectly, the fabric molding to her body like it had been designed specifically for her. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Elegant, sophisticated, dangerous. She thought about David, about the man she'd married who'd seemed so solid, so dependable. He'd promised her forever, too, right up until the gambling consumed him and forever became a series of lies wrapped in increasingly desperate schemes. The FBI surveillance van sat parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding watchers who cataloged her every movement. Margaret waved at them through her bedroom window, a gesture that felt both defiant and surrendering. Vincent Torino had drawn her into a game she didn't understand, with rules that shifted like shadows and stakes that grew higher with each move. But for the first time since David's funeral, Margaret felt like a player rather than a victim. The blue dress whispered against her skin as she moved, a constant reminder of choices that waited to be made. In 12 hours, she would sit across from a man who offered salvation wrapped in corruption, who saw her not as a desperate widow, but as someone capable of transformation. Margaret removed the dress carefully, hanging it in her closet like a uniform for a job she hadn't yet accepted. Through the window, she could see the bikes gleaming in the moonlight, 3 promises of childhood that her daughters had already claimed as their own. The cell phone sat on her nightstand, silent but somehow electric with possibility. Tomorrow night would bring answers to questions she was only beginning to understand how to ask. But tonight, Margaret Fletcher fell asleep to the sound of her daughter's breathing in the next room, holding on to the last night of a life that was about to change forever. In her dreams, she danced in a blue dress while shadows watched from the corners, applauding a performance she'd never rehearsed, but somehow knew by heart. You know what strikes me most about stories like this? They force us to examine the line between protection and corruption, between love and compromise. Margaret stands at a crossroads that millions of parents face in different forms every day. How far would you go to secure your children's future? What moral boundaries would you cross if the alternative meant watching them suffer? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the right choice and the safe choice weren't the same thing? What would you do in Margaret's position? Drop your perspective in the comments. These moral dilemmas reveal so much about who we are, when everything we care about hangs in the balance. Bella Notte existed in the spaces between legitimate business and whispered rumors. Margaret stood outside the restaurant's understated entrance, the blue dress clinging to her like armor she'd never worn before. Valet attendants moved with practiced efficiency, parking vehicles that cost more than most people's houses. This wasn't her world, but tonight she would pretend it could be. The maitre d' recognized her before she spoke. "Mrs. Fletcher, right this way." He guided her through dining rooms where conversations died mid-sentence as she passed. Where crystal glasses caught candlelight and threw it back like tiny stars. Margaret felt the weight of observation, the careful assessment of people who made careers out of reading human nature. Vincent sat at a corner table that commanded views of both the entrance and the kitchen doors. Strategic positioning that spoke of habits formed through necessity rather than preference. He stood as she approached, his movements fluid despite the injuries that had left him bleeding in her barn less than a week ago. "Margaret." He pulled out her chair with old-world courtesy that seemed genuine rather than performed. "You look beautiful." The compliment shouldn't have affected her. Margaret had learned to distrust flattery from men who wanted something, but Vincent delivered it like a simple observation, the way someone might comment on the weather. "You clean up well yourself." Vincent's suit was midnight black, perfectly tailored to disguise any evidence of recent violence. His hands, Margaret noticed, bore small cuts that spoke of struggles the newspapers would never report. But his eyes held the same intensity she remembered from the barn, the same uncomfortable ability to see past her defenses. "Have you eaten here before?" Vincent asked as a waiter materialized beside their table. "I don't think people like me usually eat at places like this." "People like you?" Margaret gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. "People who clip coupons, people who buy generic cereal, people who raise 3 daughters alone while building a business from scratch." Vincent's correction carried no judgment, only observation. "People who risk everything to help strangers." The waiter approached with the deference reserved for customers whose names appeared on certain lists. Vincent ordered wine without consulting the menu, speaking in rapid Italian that suggested familiarity with both the language and the establishment. "You own this place," Margaret realized. "I own many things, most of them more complicated than restaurants." The wine arrived with ceremonial precision. Vincent tasted it, nodded approval, and waited until their glasses were filled before speaking. Again, David owed money to Antonio Rossi. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. The name meant nothing to her, but Vincent spoke it with the reverence reserved for natural disasters. "I don't know anyone named. Rossi owns the construction company David worked for. He also owns the casino where David spent your mortgage. Payments." Vincent's voice remained conversational, but Margaret heard steel underneath the silk. "When David died, the debt transferred to his estate, to you." The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Margaret's heartbeat thundering in her ears. "How much?" $240,000. The number hit like a physical blow. Margaret set down her wine glass with trembling fingers, watching the deep red liquid tremble with her pulse. "That's impossible. David didn't gamble that much. David gambled exactly that much, plus interest, plus penalties for late payment." Vincent leaned forward slightly, his presence somehow both comforting and threatening. "Rossi has been patient, more patient than usual." "Why?" Vincent's smile carried implications that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Because he's been waiting to see if David's widow might be useful." Margaret understood. The visits from men in expensive suits, the polite inquiries about her situation, the careful assessment of her desperation. She'd been auditioned without realizing it, evaluated for a role she'd never applied for. What kind of useful? The kind that involves taking packages from one place to another, the kind that involves not asking questions. Vincent sipped his wine, studying her reaction over the rim of his glass. The kind that eventually involves your daughters growing up visiting their mother in federal prison. The waiter returned with appetizers Margaret hadn't heard them order. Delicate arrangements that looked more like art than food, each plate worth more than she typically spent on groceries in a week. "There's another option," Vincent continued. Margaret knew this was the moment she'd been brought here to hear. The offer that would reshape her understanding of what was possible, what was necessary, what was survivable. You work for me instead of Rossi. Doing what? Nothing illegal. Nothing that would endanger your daughters. Vincent cut into his appetizer with surgical precision. You have something Rossi wants. Something I need. Which is invisibility. Margaret frowned, not understanding. You're a widow with 3 children. You bake pies. You volunteer at the school fundraiser. You're exactly the kind of person federal agents don't look at twice. Vincent's eyes met hers across the table. You're the perfect camouflage. For what? Meetings, conversations, places where my presence would attract attention. Vincent paused, allowing the implications to settle. Think of it as social coordination. Margaret laughed, a sound that emerged sharper than intended. You want me to be your secretary? I want you to be my partner. The word hung between them like a bridge she could cross or burn. Partner implied equality, mutual benefit, shared risk. It was seductive in a way that simple employment could never be. And in exchange? Rossi's debt disappears. Your daughters attend private schools. Your house gets paid off. Vincent gestured around the restaurant. You become someone who belongs in places like this. Margaret studied the other diners, their casual confidence, their assumption that the world would bend to accommodate their desires. She tried to imagine Emma, Claire, and Sophie growing up with that same certainty, protected by walls built. From money and influence, what about the FBI? What about them? They're watching me. They're watching everyone. The question is whether you give them something. He glanced at it, his expression darkening almost imperceptibly. Excuse me. He stood and walked toward the restaurant's private dining rooms, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and a wine glass that seemed to refill itself. Around her, conversations continued in multiple languages, deals being struck over dessert, futures being traded like commodities. When Vincent returned, his demeanor had shifted. The polished sophistication remained, but underneath Margaret sensed coiled tension, the alertness of a predator who'd caught an unwelcome scent. We need to leave. What's wrong? Rossi's men are asking questions about you at your daughter's school. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's tired of waiting for an answer. Vincent placed cash on the table without counting it, enough to cover their meal and ensure the staff's continued discretion. His hand found the small of Margaret's back, guiding her toward a service exit she hadn't noticed before. My daughters are safe, for now. Vincent's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. But that window is closing. They emerged into an alley where a black sedan waited with its engine running. Vincent opened the passenger door, his eyes scanning the shadows for threats Margaret couldn't see, but felt like electric current against her skin. Get in. Margaret hesitated, recognizing this as another point of no return. The restaurant had been seduction. This was conscription. If I do this, if I get in that car, there's no going back. There was no going back the moment you pulled me out of the rain. Vincent's honesty was brutal and somehow comforting. The only choice now is whether you control what happens next or let it happen to you. Margaret thought about her daughters, probably asleep in their beds, dreaming of bicycle rides and wooden puzzles. She thought about David's debts and Rossi's, patients and federal agents who saw her as either an asset or an obstacle. She got in the car. As they pulled away from Bellinata, Margaret caught her reflection in the passenger window. The blue dress had transformed her into someone she barely recognized, someone capable of choices she'd never imagined making. Where are we going? Vincent's smile was visible in the dashboard lights, predatory and protective simultaneously. To collect your daughters. And then somewhere Rossi will never think to look. The sedan accelerated through empty streets, carrying Margaret Fletcher toward a future that glittered with promise and reeked of compromise. Behind them, the restaurant's lights faded like stars being swallowed by an approaching storm. The safe, house sat in the mountains like a forgotten secret, its windows dark against the forest that pressed close on all sides. Margaret carried a sleeping Sophie while Vincent led Emma and Claire up the gravel path, their footsteps muffled by pine needles that had accumulated like years of silence. Inside, the house revealed itself as a contradiction. Rustic exterior, hiding sophisticated interior, complete with security systems that blinked red in the darkness and communication equipment that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than mountain retreats. "How long do we stay here?" Margaret asked, settling Sophie onto a leather couch that probably cost more than her annual income. "Until it's safe." Vincent moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking locks, activating systems, transforming their refuge into a fortress with invisible walls. Emma stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the darkness beyond. "I can't see any lights?" "That's the point," Vincent replied, his voice gentler than Margaret had heard before. "Sometimes the safest place is where nobody thinks to look." The girls explored their temporary home with the adaptability of children, claiming bedrooms and investigating gadgets they'd never seen before. Their laughter echoed through rooms designed for much darker purposes, a sound that seemed to soften Vincent's edges in ways Margaret hadn't expected. "They like you," she observed, watching him help Claire program the entertainment system. "Kids see things adults miss." Vincent's attention remained focused on the remote control, but Margaret caught something vulnerable in his profile. "They don't care about your mistakes, only whether you're kind to them in the moment." Margaret studied this man who'd torn her life apart and rebuilt it in the span of a week. In the soft light of the safe house, surrounded by her daughter's voices, Vincent seemed less like a predator and more like someone who'd forgotten what normal families looked like. "Do you have children?" The question emerged before Margaret could stop it. Vincent's hands stilled on the remote, his expression cycling through emotions too quick to catalog. "I had a daughter, long time ago." The past tense hung in the air like smoke. Margaret waited, recognizing the particular silence that surrounded old wounds. She would have been Emma's age now. Vincent's voice carried the careful control of someone who'd learned to speak around broken glass. "Her mother took her away when she realized what I was becoming. Do you know where they are? Better that I don't." Vincent stood abruptly, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. But Margaret had seen behind the mask, glimpsed the man who existed beneath the reputation. He wasn't just protecting them from Rossi. He was trying to give her daughters something he'd lost forever. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in bedrooms that looked like luxury hotel suites, Margaret found Vincent standing on the deck overlooking the valley. The city sprawled below them like scattered stars, beautiful and distant. "Regrets?" she asked. Every day, Vincent didn't look at her, his attention fixed on lights that might as well have been other galaxies. But regret is a luxury. It doesn't change what needs to be done. Margaret joined him at the railing, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the mountain chill. "What happens now?" "Now you decide who you want to be. I thought you already decided that for me." Vincent turned finally, his dark eyes reflecting starlight like promises and threats combined. "I gave you options. The choice is still yours." Below them, the city pulsed with life they were no longer part of. Margaret thought about her old house, probably being watched by federal agents and Rossi's men simultaneously. She thought about the woman she'd been a week ago, baking pies at 4 a.m. and believing that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect the people she loved. "If I do this, if I become your partner, what happens to my daughters? They grow up safe, educated, protected." Vincent's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd learned to control outcomes through will and resources. "They never have to worry about money or men like Rossi or sleeping in cars because they can't make rent, and they never know their mother. They know a version of her, the version that kept them alive." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of futures spreading before her like roads in different directions. Each choice carried its own cost, its own compromise. "The FBI will keep looking for me. Let them look. By the time they figure out where you are, you'll be someone else entirely." Vincent reached into his jacket, producing a passport that bore Margaret's photograph but a different name, Elena Marchetti. The woman in the picture looked like her, but harder somehow, more sophisticated, more dangerous. New identity, new background, new life. Vincent handed her the document, their fingers brushing in the transfer. Elena Marchetti is a widow from Chicago. She inherited money from her late husband's import business. She's moving to the mountains for her daughter's health. Margaret studied the passport, recognizing the quality of the forgery, the attention to detail that spoke of resources beyond her imagination. How long have you been planning this? Since the moment I saw you in that barn. Vincent's honesty was devastating in its simplicity. You were already in danger, Margaret. I just offered you a way to control it. The mountains stretched around them like sleeping giants, indifferent to human struggles but somehow protective in their ancient silence. Margaret thought about Emma's questions, Claire's laughter, Sophie's trust. 3 small lives that depended on choices she was still learning how to make. What about you? What about me? Do you get a new identity too? Do you become someone else? Vincent's smile was barely visible in the darkness, but Margaret felt its impact like warmth from a distant fire. I've been someone else for so long. I'm not sure who I was originally. Maybe that's not what matters. Margaret turned the passport over in her hands, feeling its weight like responsibility made tangible. Maybe what matters is who you choose to be now. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither had spoken aloud. Margaret understood that accepting this new identity meant accepting Vincent as part of her life, part of her daughter's lives. The man who'd bled in her barn would become the man who protected their future. Elena Marchetti, she said, testing the name on her tongue. She's stronger than Margaret Fletcher, more confident, less afraid. And Vincent Torino? Disappears, along with everyone who was looking for him. Vincent stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could see her reflection in his eyes. But the man who loves your daughters, who wants to give them everything they deserve, he stays. Love. The word hung between them like a bridge neither had expected. Vincent fall in love with her family piece by piece, moment by moment, without recognizing it until now. This is insane. Sanity is overrated. Margaret laughed despite herself, a sound that echoed off the mountains and returned changed, stronger somehow. My daughters will have questions. Children adapt faster than adults. They'll accept the new normal because it's better than the old one. Through the windows behind them, Margaret could see Emma, Claire, and Sophie sleeping peacefully in beds that cost more than most cars. Tomorrow they would wake up as different people in a different world, with futures that stretched toward horizons their mother had never dared imagine. Okay, Margaret whispered. Vincent's smile was answer enough. He kissed her then, softly at first, then with the desperation of a man who'd found something worth protecting after years of destroying everything he touched. When they broke apart, Margaret Fletcher was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love sometimes wore the mask of criminality, that protection required compromise, that the choices that saved your family weren't always the choices that saved your soul. Elena Marchetti looked out over the valley, seeing not lights but possibilities, not distance but freedom. The woman who'd baked pies in the darkness was gone forever, but the mother who would do anything to protect her daughters had just been born. Here we are at the end of this journey, watching Margaret become Elena, seeing how love and desperation can reshape our fundamental understanding of right and wrong. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the lengths we'll go to protect those we love. What strikes me most is how the story refuses to give us easy answers. Is Margaret saved or corrupted? Is Vincent a villain or a savior? Maybe the truth is that life rarely offers us purely good choices. Sometimes we have to choose between bad and worse and hope we can live with the consequences. I'm curious about your thoughts on this transformation. Do you think Margaret made the right choice? Could you see yourself making similar decisions if your family's survival was at stake? What does this story reveal about the nature of morality when everything you care about hangs in the balance? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to continue exploring these complex moral territories together. Stories like this help us examine our own boundaries, our own values, our own capacity for change when the stakes become impossibly high.